Alright, I really think this module is very important because at some point all of us have experienced loneliness. Some of us more than others, but this module will help you understand what loneliness is, what contributes to it, and also some great ways that we can overcome it. Now, again, loneliness doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have social relationships or intimate relationships. That obviously can cause loneliness if you don't have a lot of those connections. But sometimes people have a lot of those connections, but they don't feel satisfying. They don't really meet the needs of that person. So again, loneliness can refer to a couple of different things, and we all have different needs. Some people don't need a lot of close social connections, other people do. So again, loneliness can differ from person to person. There's 5 different types of loneliness that I want you to be aware of. And the first is emotional loneliness. This usually comes as a child from the absence of an intimate attachment figure. That can be a parent, it can be a caregiver. As an adult, it's usually more of a romantic type of loneliness, or maybe a best friend, but you just don't have that close emotional connection with somebody. That's very different from social loneliness, which is about the groups of people. Again, human beings are social animals. We, even introverts, even shy people, usually want some type of group interaction, whether it's family or friends or work or school or what have you. And if you don't have some of that, that can also make you feel lonely. The third type is transient loneliness. Now, this is when you just kind of have sporadic, intermittent feelings of loneliness that aren't really tied to anything, but maybe there's just points in your life where you felt lonely, and they go away, and everything goes back to normal. That's different from transitional loneliness, where maybe things were great for a while, and then maybe you move, or maybe you have a death in your family. There's some dramatic shift in your network and your connections, and so loneliness occurs as a result. Those two words are similar, so make sure you know the difference. Transient is just sporadic loneliness throughout your life. Transitional is when things are great, and then something happens and you get lonely. Obviously, the worst of these is usually chronic loneliness. That's the 5th type I want you to know. This refers to people who just haven't been able to create a satisfactory relationship with someone. So they have felt lonely for a very long time. Again, anyone can feel lonely. Some groups are more likely to be lonely than others. People that actually just begin college, especially if they've moved away from home, are at a higher risk for experiencing loneliness, as are adolescents going through things, especially gay and lesbian adolescents who aren't in an accepting environment. So again, there's some things that can make you more likely to be lonely, but really anybody can be. Alright, let me be very clear that the 5 factors that kind of contribute to loneliness do not necessarily cause loneliness. These are things that might be related to them, but it's not always true of people that have any of these 5 characteristics or experiences. But these 5 can contribute to feelings of loneliness. The first refers to early experiences, usually early childhood experiences. That can be at school or with peers. Maybe you don't communicate very well, people make fun of you. Obviously that can make you feel lonely. Sometimes that can come from parents as well. Usually parents who are neglectful or really rejecting, even abusive. That can create feelings of loneliness in someone as well. Second contributor is social trends. Now this one's interesting. Again, a lot of this is fairly recent research, and it's based on how we as a species react with one another, how we communicate and develop relationships. Again, when we all, hundreds of years ago, lived in the same community and we all saw each other, every day, the same people, you didn't move away from your family. Everybody you knew was right there, usually in the same mile or so. You had a lot of social connections, and sometimes those can be very deep. There's a lot of research that suggests, again, doesn't say for sure, but suggests that with our technologically driven society, social isolation is actually increasing. So even though we're very connected, and we have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I've always got my phone, my smartphone, and my iPad, I'm communicating all the time with lots of different types of people, but the value of those relationships may not actually satisfy your feelings of loneliness. Again, you can be very lonely even if you're communicating with hundreds or thousands of people, especially if it's just online, because we do crave that in-person interaction. The next is shyness. Now again, just because you're shy doesn't mean necessarily that you feel lonely, but if you have difficulty expressing yourself in large groups of people, maybe you're self-conscious, you're timid, that can create feelings of loneliness because you might be more reserved in social settings and miss out on opportunities to develop those relationships. Kind of related to that are poor social skills. Now, again, maybe you didn't learn them from your parents or from your childhood interaction, but if you don't know how to effectively communicate with people, obviously that can limit their relationships and the quality of those relationships as well. People who are lonely have a tendency to not reveal as much about themselves, to kind of sit back when everybody's sharing, and so that can make people feel not as invested or not as connected to you, and it just kind of keeps that cycle of loneliness going. The last one I think is one of the worst, and that's a self-defeating attributional style. Much of the time, people who are lonely blame themselves for that, and it's not always the case at all. But if you constantly don't feel like you have friends who love you or romantic partners that care about you, sometimes you can say that that has to do with you and that you don't deserve those things, that you're not worth being loved or having close relationships. And that's very sad because everybody deserves that kind of closeness if they want it. So you have to kind of train yourself to not really think those negative thoughts, because if you have them, that can really create loneliness and make it even more difficult when you're experiencing it. Okay, the good news is if you are or have ever felt lonely or ever do feel lonely in the future, there are things that you can do to combat that. Now, obviously there's exceptions to that. If you're stationed overseas somewhere where you don't really know anyone, maybe you're by yourself, maybe you're in prison in solitary confinement. That's a really bizarre and rare example. But I guess I'm just trying to make it clear that you don't always have control over your situation. But you do have control over how you approach the situation sometimes. And that's what these suggestions for conquering loneliness hopefully will help you do. The first is to use technology. Now, wait, Mr. Keene, you just said that technology might be making us more lonely. Well, that might be true, but especially for people who don't have access to people similar to them, the internet can be a great way to feel less alone. Again, my own experience growing up, I was in a very conservative environment. There were no openly gay people around me. So even in college, I didn't know anyone who was openly gay. And the internet was one way for me to find people who were, kind of anonymously, and talk to them and see what they were going through and see how they felt without having to kind of out myself or to drive to California to finally meet someone who's gay. So again, the internet can be a great thing, especially with things like Facebook and Instagram. You can find people who have the same interests, who have the same kinds of feelings that you do, and that can be a way to thwart loneliness. The second is to avoid the temptation to withdraw from social situations. Again, I think I've told you guys, I was very shy as a kid. I didn't have the best social skills. So when I was feeling lonely, my go-to reaction was to just avoid people. Obviously, that's not going to help you overcome your loneliness. So that might be what you want to do, but fight that. Go do something public. Go do something social, even if it's a tiny thing. Because if you just keep staying by yourself, that loneliness is never going to go away, and it'll actually get worse. The next is to try to break that habit of the negative self-talk. Again, easier said than done, especially if you have a history of kind of putting yourself down. But when you are thinking about how you have contributed to your loneliness, and maybe you have, think about the behaviors that you've done, because behaviors don't define you, and they're changeable. So maybe you've always avoided this setting, and you think that's why you're lonely. Well, you can actually stop avoiding that. Maybe you've always done this when people compliment you. You can change that. So think about maybe your perceived weaknesses as just behaviors that you can change. Then finally is to improve your social skills. Again, these are things that can get better. I used to have very, very, very poor social skills. I am by far not a social skills master now, but I used to be so awkward and so socially anxious and shy that I wouldn't even talk to my own family. I just kind of huddle in the corner and be very, very quiet. Going to school, giving oral presentations, studying psychology, studying the things you're learning right now are all things that helped me engage in better social skills. So when people that knew me back in the day know that I'm a college professor, or they see me at a party and I'm chatting people up, they're like, who is that guy? Because teenage Wes was not like that at all. So the good news is, again, social skills are something that you can always improve and always continue to grow on. I'm still trying to improve mine. Hopefully this module has given you some tips on how to improve yours, and hopefully, most importantly, if you're feeling lonely at all, maybe you understand why, and maybe you understand some things that you can do to start feeling better about that. That's my hope for you guys.